This video cassette, made under the auspices of the Rolls-Royce Owners Club, concerns the tuning up of the Phantom I engine American. One of the first things to determine if your engine is not functioning properly is what is the compression in each of the 6 cylinders. This is the side of the engine where we shall remove the spark plugs and check the compression of each of the cylinders. In order to get to number 1, we remove the distributor cap to give easy access to its spark plug. Each of the plugs, of course, is examined to see their gap as well as their color, which tells a great deal about why the engine might not be running properly. For instance, this plug is in fair condition physically, but has a black soot covering it, indicating very likely that the carburetor is set far too rich. Number 2 is being removed. Quite often, spark plugs from the same engine will show different colors. When that happens, one would be suspicious of maybe leaks in the intake manifold or malfunction of the valves. Naturally, an oily coat indicates that the rings are probably passing too much oil, or that oil is coming down the intake stem. It's a long way between number 1 and 6, but it must be done. Before compression is checked, make certain your throttle is opened, emergency brake set, ignition off, and someone in the car to press the starter button. Here we are inserting the threaded end of the compression checker. Now someone in the car will press the starter for at least 4 revolutions. Normal compression in a healthy P1 engine is 55 to 60 pounds per square inch. I believe this cylinder did show 60. So all is healthy in that one, and on a piece of paper we'd record that fact. Number 2 also checked 60 pounds. But number 3 showed an illness. Here we have number 3, comes to 40. Check it several times when this happens. But 40 it is, indicating that we have a little trouble in that cylinder, and shortly we'll determine what it is. So with number 3 at 40 pounds, dry check, we will squirt oil, enough of it to cover the top of the piston, and hence seal for a little while at least any leaks in the rings. Now if the compression comes back up to 60 with this wet test, we will know that the trouble is in the cylinder wall, the rings, or the piston, and not in the valves. There, it goes to 60 like 1 and 2. There's oil on top of the piston, so we know that our trouble is there, namely, probably rings. All cylinders should check within 15 pounds. This engine was running reasonably well, even with 40 pounds in number 3. Sometimes the rings can be loosened up by application of penetrating oil. This horrible specimen of a well-corroded piston with stuck rings was taken out of an engine which had been in storage many years. Naturally, the compression was practically nothing. You can see the rings corroded into their grooves. They won't move, they won't hug the cylinder wall and seal it off. The piston is probably salvageable. The rings can be removed, but no doubt they'll be broken in getting them out and new ones inserted. Now here is a piston from an engine which had been running about 5,000 miles. You'll notice the good wear pattern on the side of the piston, and all of the rings are free. They're not only free, but they fit the grooves nicely, namely, the groove has not been worn. Notice the aluminum plug in the end of the wrist pin, which prevents it from migrating over and scoring the cylinder wall. This piston does not have stops in it. Namely, the rings can rotate around and around. Well, the valves are important, and here is a new one. A nice, shiny, even ground stem, a lip which will seal on the seat in the head, no carbon as yet under the head of the valve. Started to roll away, and notice that the lip thickness is adequate to prevent burning. This thickness, if it becomes a knife edge, greatly shortens the life of the valve and hinders its proper sealing. Here's a specimen the like of which we would wish to avoid. The stem is rough and is carboned. A heavy layer of crud is under the head. And obviously, the facing lip is badly either corroded or fire burned. This probably comes from having adjusted the tappets too close, and the valve did not get a chance to get back on its seat and cool. Here's the same valve. You can see that the lip itself has not been allowed to come down on the seat in the head. This is one from an aluminum head engine, exhaust valve, which of course was having water from a defective head, which caused severe corrosion. This engine had very low compression on two cylinders adjacent, and the evidence showed that the trouble was in the cylinder gasket, or the head gasket. Notice the carbon trace between the two cylinders, indicating that they were communicating and lowering the compression. Excessive clearance between the valve stem and its guide will allow oil to come into the engine. It also might be so bad as to cause the valve to go oval, or at least not round. Here we see a split guide to more dramatically show the relation between the valve stem and its guide. One way of using the old guides is to knurl them, and this is a cutaway view of a repaired knurled guide. Obviously, this rocker arm has been striking the valve many, many times, and if one attempts to adjust the tappet clearance with too wide a feeler gauge, it will bridge the gap, and you will not get an accurate setting. So, if you don't have time to fix your rocker arms properly, at least use a tapered feeler gauge to get a proper setting. In repairing the rocker arm, stellite is put on the defective surface, and by using a very nice jig, we grind it back like this one to the proper radius. A properly stellited end here will last far longer than the original. This is the eccentric which is used to adjust the tappet clearance on the Phantom I. It is peculiar just to the Phantom I engine. Notice that the hole is off center. Naturally, when it is rotated, it changes the height of the center line and hence changes the adjustment of the clearance between the rocker arm and the end of the valve. Once again, this is peculiar to the Phantom I engine. Here is the gashed wheel attached to the eccentric bushing, which of course moves eccentrically about its center line. Notice that it has been strained. Someone has attempted to adjust the valves without loosening the end bolt. Here we see the worm in place, being rotated by the screwdriver. The eccentric bushing is shown here in its proper place. Notice how the fingers are transparent. And to dramatize the affair, there is the worm and the wheel. Shown here are the two coils and the two distributors, and we shall go through a little procedure to make sure that they are functioning properly. Now the top of the coil should be, of course, clean and free of dirt. Here we are inspecting for corrosion and dirt. Clean it out if it's dirty, and for cracks around the base, for corrosion and evidence of poor contact. Back in after we're sure that it's clean. Each of the plug wires should be clean and of course free of any corrosion. Just looking things over to be sure that everything is shipshape. And you look for cracks on the outside. Looking at the inside of the cap, where moisture plays havoc with it, we want to be sure that we see no signs of a spider web blackening between contacts, that the center contact of carbon is backed up by a good spring, and that there is no evidence of crosstalk. Depicted here and showing the points making and breaking, and with rotor and now without rotor, is the distributor head. Notice how very badly pitted the points are. Another view of a distributor from an engine which was running poorly, and this is certainly one of the reasons why it might have done that. Notice the very badly pitted points, probably resulting from a poor or no condenser at all. The pencil is pointing to the point. Well, there's nothing to do but to replace those points. And so let's take a look at the procedure. There is the movable point with its fiber writing on the cam. That's the stationary point. There's the threaded section that holds it in. Condenser. The circlip is removed. Don't lose it. Many do. Then the lead from the condenser. There, bend that down. And now the movable point can be pried off of its stud. Be sure you keep track of the various springs. And notice again the obviously pitted point. The condenser is held on by this screw. Take it off and check it before reassembly. The stationary point is held on by a little lock nut. Notice how nice and clean the fingers are that are taking this element off. Back the nut off, and then of course remove the stationary point itself. There we are. Clean everything up before reassembly. A bad ground on the condenser might make one think that the condenser itself was not good. Reinserting the new point. Pretty soon the little end will emerge, and that's of course where the lock nut goes. Now the movable point with its spring is put in position. The condenser reassembled. Its lead tucked in the right position and tightened. And the circlip. Note that the high point of the cam is resting on the fiber block of the movable point. The correct gap at this point is 20 thousandths. The feeler gauge is coming in from the top, and we adjust the stationary point until we feel just a faint friction with the 20 thousandth shim stock between the points. At that point, of course, we lock up the lock nut and check it again to be very sure that the strain of locking it did not change the adjustment. A very useful, even necessary check is the determination of the dwell, which means angularity, that the points are closed. Here we have a 44-degree dwell, which means that for every firing of a spark plug, the points are closed 44 degrees of the rotation of the cam in the distributor. It naturally is very desirable to have both distributors show exactly the same dwell. Indeed, these have been adjusted so that ideal condition is achieved. Next, we are going to show how to adjust the two distributors so that the ignition is timed correctly and they fire at the same time in the respective cylinders. The screwdriver is loosening the clamp that holds the base of the entire distributor assembly. Notice that it can be moved back and forth. And the other distributor has a similar clamp. Timing of the two distributors is achieved by using a strobe light attached to number 1 cylinder and with the ignition fully advanced. Here we are removing the cover plate, and notice the MA on the flywheel, meaning manual advanced. While someone else is moving the distributor body left and right, we look at it with the strobe light and attempt to get a condition where the mark on the flywheel is lined up with the stationary mark on the housing. Naturally, both distributors must be in this position. The gear train used to drive these two distributors is easily seen by going to the cutaway Phantom I engine. The worm gear drives the vertical shaft, which in turn drives two larger gears, which drive the distributor cam. Each distributor is equipped with a centrifugal advance mechanism. That mechanism is at the top of the picture. You can see the condenser above it and the rotor rotating with it. The faster this mechanism is rotated, the greater is the advance of the ignition. Here we are doing it by hand. Notice that the rotor up above is advanced. This is made necessary by the inherent characteristics of the internal combustion engine needing early ignition. And here we have the coil with its easily seen primary and secondary. The primary is the larger wire on the outside. Depicted here is the right-hand side, or the carburetor side, of the Springfield Phantom I engine. This is the air valve, the high-speed jet with its adjusting knurled nut, spring preloaded. There's the adjusting nut itself. In the back is the low-speed jet. The lever system is very interesting. The lever system, of course, is controlled from the quadrant by the steering wheel. The finger is pointing to the low-speed jet with its adjusting screw and lock nut. All too often, malfunction of the engine occurs when we have a sticky air valve. This device uncovers the high-speed jet, and when it is not functioning properly, the engine will not get full power. It should take about 2 seconds for the piston to come down. The top is being removed. These parts are beautifully made and delicate. The aluminum cover plate has attached to it the return spring. The piston itself is shown being removed, and the very accurately machined brass cylinder is being cleaned without the use of any abrasive. Do not attempt to use any kind of abrasive in this operation. The piston itself wants to be wiped with a clean, dry cloth, once again making sure that no abrasive is used. Naturally, without the top on it, the piston rises and falls at the slightest urging. When the spring is properly adjusted, it barely holds the top aluminum cover from the lip of the brass body. This ring will force it down and make an airtight seal. It is actually vacuum which is transmitted to the top of the piston, which causes this to rise and uncovers the high-speed jet. Here we're looking down and seeing the high-speed jet. A little bit more of this pretty soon in the cutaway from the side. The cutaway of the Phantom I carburetor. Directly in the center is the float chamber. The finger is pressing the float itself upward. And that, of course, actuates the needle valve. This is the high-speed jet with its spring return at the bottom, which quite often becomes inoperative because of crud. There's the lever system of the high-speed jet. Any attempt to clean the carburetor must be made with scrupulous care. This is the butterfly valve. Well, we go to the rocker arms. Here we see an ample supply of oil flowing down the top of each push rod. This is a must in order that the tappets below them will not wear out. Yes, every one shows oil coming through the rocker arm and going down the push rod. I have a lot of rocker arm here. A terrible thing was discovered. Notice the green. It's a slight lower left. The pencil is pushing into it. It's antifreeze. The finger is pointing to the lock nut, to the rocker arm of the intake, to the adjusting screw of both intake and exhaust. Before any tappet adjustment is made, this lock nut must be loosened. Otherwise, the little gearing might well be stripped. We are going to adjust to 0.007 or 7 thousandths, hot, while the engine is running. Notice the screwdriver is being moved left to right until we achieve the correct adjustment. Then the lock nut is tightened, but make sure that a double check is conducted to know that the setting did not change. Back to that leaky plug. The water has been drained from the head. We're going to use soap on the outside and about 15 pounds air pressure inside. We were fortunate here in that the leak was found to be in one of the core plugs and was easily fixed putting a measure under it. Now oil floats on water. Periodically, check the crankcase for the presence of water. The two do not mix, and internal damage may result. The vacuum gauge is attached to a non-running engine with partially open throttle being turned by its starter. Now the throttle has been closed. There's enough vacuum to actuate the starting carburetor. Here the engine was started, and then it failed. It was started again, and 17 to 18 inches of vacuum. Very good for a Phantom I engine. We have found that the best running position of the low-speed jet is achieved when the maximum amount of vacuum is registered on this gauge. The finger is tapping the low-speed adjusting nut. Notice as that nut is turned, the vacuum will rise and fall. Once again, the best running position for the engine is when you have maximum vacuum in the intake manifold. It's a very sensitive adjustment, but really very forthright and easily made. The rocker arms must be removed to retorque the head. The asbestos copper gasket, over a period of time, will compress. This may lead to leakage between the cylinders, and it certainly will change the setting of the valves. After the newly repaired engine has run a few hundred miles, it is a very prudent thing to remove the rocker arms, such as are being done here, and retorque the head to 25 foot-pounds. It is possible to make a crow's foot wrench to do most of this, but we find that it is more forthright and probably more reliable, and it doesn't take much time, to remove the rocker arm assembly. Fish out all the nuts and washers. Above all, don't let anything go down alongside the push rod. My goodness, there are a lot of nuts to take off. All the nuts have now been removed. The entire assembly will come off of its studs. This is the diagram recommended by Rolls showing the sequence of tightening the stud nuts. Once again to 25 foot-pounds. Use a torque wrench, of course. Follow the diagram which appears in the Phantom I booklet. Rolls speaks of a experienced fitter being able to do this. The experienced fitter, however, might well be advised to use a torque wrench. Follow the diagram. The rocker arms are being reassembled, and of course the valve adjustment will have to be checked. Tighten the nuts of the rocker shaft gently and evenly to preclude bending of that shaft because of the uneven valve spring pressure. It is possible to bend the shaft if one nut is tightened too radically over its neighbor. Notice how we're going over them slightly and lightly, but all the same. The tappet adjustment probably will change because of the change in thickness of the head gasket. If it doesn't, you're lucky. We seem to be having a very good score here. Once again, it's 7 thousandths on the aluminum head Phantom I engine while running and hot. The old adage, "I'd rather hear the valve than smell it," is certainly true. By using 2 single filament bulbs properly hooked up, it is possible to properly synchronize the ignition towers without having a strobe light. Here we see the bulbs being bolted to a ground. Be sure everything is clean and tight. The other contact, with an alligator clip on each end, will be affixed to the live end, the live side of the distributor. Naturally, when the points are closed, the current is going through the primary of the coil, and the light will not go on. But when the points are opened, and that's when the spark occurs, the light will go on because the current is then passing through it. This is a visual way of telling when the points are opening. Number 2 has just had his alligator clip attached. Now the quadrant is being moved up and down, and notice that the lights come on, but not quite at the same time. That means that the distributor is not synchronized. All of this is done with manual advance. The flywheel must be positioned correctly in relation to the marks on the housing, and the quadrant lever in the upper position. 1 ignition, 2 ignition, and both. Watch the little lights at the top. As the lever is moved up and down, you can see them glow, but not at the same time. What we want to do is to get both of them to go on at the upper position of the lever. We'll go around shortly and see how that's done. There's a binding screw at the base of each distributor, which when loosened, enables it to be rotated. Now there is one on, moving up slowly on the lever. The other one will shortly go on. And of course we want to use the one that's furthest up. Now the lever will come back down. The light on the left has been set to break the points with the quadrant lever in the far up position, and we are now going to adjust the one on the left to be the same. There we have it. You can see the movement of the distributor body. Just as the light goes on, we'll tighten the binder screw. Go back, of course, and check everything to make certain that movement has not occurred upon tightening of the binder screw. Off at the same time. Back again, checking manual advance. Being sure that the flywheel is in the correct position, we're firing number 1. Here we have a way of synchronizing by watching the ammeter. As the quadrant lever is moved up and down, of course, the primary coil will be charged. And when the points break, that's when you get your spark. The needle will go back to 0. And since we have a switch that controls number 1 and 2, we can make sure that they cut in and out at the same position of the quadrant lever. Fuel starvation plagues most of these cars from time to time. Its symptoms are inability to run fast and a violent barking back through the carburetor. We start by examining the cleanliness of the filters in the tank. The pipes have been disconnected. The 4 bolts holding it in are unscrewed. Make sure when you're doing this that no incendiary material is around and that you have a fire extinguisher. The filter assembly lifted out bodily. Watch the gasoline drip out of it. Look at the 2 different lengths. Here we have the regular one. The cotter is removed, the retaining washer and its spring, and by jiggling we'll get the filter element itself out. Notice it's rather heavily loaded with apprapte. This is made of very fine bronze mesh. We're rubbing it there. You can see the mesh underneath the crud. It can be cleaned by using a suede brush and compressed air. This one is really very clean compared to many. Some of them are black with tar. The reserve, which is the longer of the 2, was a little dirtier. We know it's a reserve because it goes down to the bottom of the tank. It's a Maxwell House thing, good to the last drop. There the pieces are again. And here we're, after cleaning the elements, the filters, we're putting it back together. Once again, the reserve is on the right. The regular, the shorter of the 2, is on the left. There's the pressure spring, the locating washer, and the stainless steel cotter key. And a pair of pliers to open the cotter. The element is slipped in, then the spring, then the washer, and the retaining cotter. The same with the regular filter. They are incidentally the same length. They're really interchangeable. The spring, the retaining washer, and the cotter. Open the cotter, of course, so that it cannot slip out. And the other one. Well, that will take care of fuel starvation if it had occurred from stopped up filters. And here we have the vacuum tank, which is a device that sucks up the gas from the big tank in back and delivers it down this pipe to the float bowl of the carburetor. All too often, vapor lock occurs because of the proximity to the exhaust manifold, but that's another story. Now, we might suspect, if the trouble persists, that the line from the vacuum tank to the big tank in back is stopped up. And so we get a good friend to huff and puff here, while somebody goes back to the tank and listens in the filler spout to see if the telltale glug, glug, glug can be heard. Here's Norman listening. Yep, he hears the glug, 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 so we know that that line is clear. We might suspect that there's a stoppage in the line from the intake manifold to the vacuum tank. So we'll break the joint. And turning the engine over with the starter, putting our finger on the end of it, we should feel a pulsation of vacuum, and indeed we do, so we know that line is clear. Now the malaise might be in the vacuum tank itself, and here's the cutaway. The hand is moving the float up and down. Look at the toggle joints working. The valve on the far left is from the vacuum. Next to it is the release to atmosphere. And of course the gasoline comes down the one to the right. There again is the vacuum valve, the valve which releases things to atmosphere, and the filler stock for the gasoline. The click, click, click of a properly working vacuum tank is a nice thing to hear, and if your tank is working correctly, you can easily hear it from the outside. At the bottom is a flapper valve. If this flapper valve is not tight, and many aren't because this piece of plastic warps, the efficiency of the vacuum tank will be greatly hindered. Now here we have a glass bowl model of it. You can see the vacuum is sucking gas, but is also sucking partly air. That means that part of the time when it should be sucking gas, it's sucking air. And at high speeds, you may have failure of supply of gas. Normally, this flapper valve is running under gasoline, and when that happens, of course, the efficiency goes up. Here you see it pumping up. The valve is released, depositing gas in the tank. It's actually effectively a little pump. Well, the starting carburetor, shown here in section, is an absolute must for starting a Phantom I, especially on a cold day. Here we see the main valve, which of course when opened, admits the mixture from the starting carburetor to the intake manifold. The pencil is going to point and will push down the cylinder which is drawn down by the vacuum. The gasoline comes up there, goes through an orifice, is mixed, and comes out into the intake manifold through the big valve. It is, in effect, an SU carburetor, a miniature one. We're going to take it apart. There's the main valve. Unscrew the center nut, and we have the base. Then the retaining washer, which centers the spring. and the spring itself, and then the cylinder. When that cylinder is drawn down, the air holes, you notice them on the side there, are opened up. The air goes down through, past the orifice, and delivers a mixture of vapor, very rich vapor, to the intake manifold. The quantity of gasoline allowed is determined by the position of the needle valve in its orifice. The venturi is formed when the piston is drawn down by the vacuum. Norman has a fixation on that needle valve, and he wants very much for all of you to see it. There it is again. Now let's take a look at the parts in the cutaway. It might make it a little bit easier to understand. You can see the needle being run down into the orifice, thereby restricting the flow of gas. Backing it away will allow more to come in. You'd need to back it away on cold weather. And there, in fact, is the bottom of the orifice. That little black hole there in the center. Here's a close-up view of the needle. Quite often these are jammed down into the orifice and burred. In that case, take it apart, put it in a jeweler's lathe, and reform the point. This is the cylinder, which once again, when drawn down, it must seal there. And they quite often get carboned up on backfires. It must fit nicely in its cylinder. And of course, if all goes well, when this is opened, you will get a very rich starting mixture in the intake manifold. Should there be excessive leakage here, you might lose part of the vacuum. It might even be necessary to nickel plate and turn back to make a tight joint in that area there. Clean these parts with a clean cloth, never with abrasive. Of course, you're not going to get vacuum unless the butterfly valve is closed. This shows the lever on the side, and we go to the cutaway engine for a better view of that butterfly valve. There it is. You cannot get the starting carburetor to work unless that valve is closed. And here you can see the lever mechanism coming through the firewall, which when turned from the instrument panel will open and shut the starting carburetor. Properly adjusted, the starting carburetor need not be run except to start the engine. It gives a very rich mixture. On the instrument board, there's a lever. Turn it on there. Bring both levers down. The right one for the spark, the left one will close the butterfly valve. Your mixture lever should be put over to strong. This is for starting a cold engine. Now, the adjustment of the starting carburetor, loosen the binder nut, run gently the needle down until you feel it bottom, and back it off about 2 turns. Then tighten the binder nut. In cold weather, you might have to back this off a little more. We've attached to the intake manifold a method of putting a vacuum gauge on. And we are going to show that unless the butterfly valve be closed, the vacuum will not be sufficient to get the starting carburetor to work. And you can see the lever being moved up and down there to your left. No vacuum when it's up, big vacuum when it's down. Of course, the butterfly valve is open when the lever goes up and closed when it's down. Now for the adjustment of the high and the low speed jets. We take out the air valve so that you may better see the position of these 2 jets. The high speed is on the left, being pointed to by the pencil. There we are. It's attached to an arm, of course. And the low speed is on the right. There's its knurled knob and a binder screw behind it. And it is that one that has to be turned to get the best vacuum and the best running condition of the engine on idle. They're linked together by a very nice lever system. Now there, the engine is running. Notice that the needle is shaking and that the vacuum is not as high as it can be. The shaking needle indicates a very shaky engine. The hand now is adjusting the low-speed jet. And notice that when the vacuum is maximum, the shake of the needle is the least and the engine is running the smoothest. Naturally, one can go rich and lean on both sides and then come back to bracket the target. There we are, off again. Turn it back to where the engine is running the sweetest.